which I call Derrida the Photomat. My remark really begins by recounting 6 sorts of performativity. It sort of rounds up, I guess, some discussion. I'm sure there are others I haven't thought of, but at least came up with 6 of them. I do that before discussing what circa 1980 some of us took to be a performative turn in Derrida's published work. Bear in mind that by then speech act theory had replaced semiotics as the latest theoretical infatuation. Semiotics was still sort of riding high around 1976. Then Umberto Eco published that book on semiotics, which kind of killed it all. And there's an interesting story, which we won't go into, but that kind of happened at that moment. And right after that, everybody kind of got into speech act theory, and it was like this big relief. We didn't have to crack our heads over the signifier and the signified anymore. We could talk about other kinds of things. I think that's part of what happened, but also there was that famous debate with John Searle that Derrida had. I think that made speech act theory kind of at the top of people's list for a few minutes. I think in general, as I was just saying, it was something that was a bit easier to grasp, and it seemed to be more promising in terms of the perspective of literary and cultural analysis. Summarizing the Derridian approaches to performativity, I begin more or less ad hoc with the following. There are 6 of them. Number 1, partage des voix. The division of voices that often occurs in Derrida's writings and that recalls the traditional genre of the philosophical dialogue. Though in this case, one can't always tell the subjects apart, even if they are but split off bits of the self that are speaking to one another, as in the essay Restitutions. To recall a paper given yesterday, this division speaks to what in de la grammatologie is called espacement. However, in terms of the literary critical influence, one senses the influence of Blanchot's vocal murmurings, for example, in Le Pas au-delà. 2, improvisation. This was discussed in yesterday's roundtable and often concerns the emergence of various supplementary remarks that have the function of supplément or Zusatz, whereby the addition is both too much and too little at the same time, hence opening up new horizons for improvisatory development. As is quite obvious, Derrida's many interviews have often been very improvisatory, something that was already established in the pivotal interviews that Derrida entitled Positions. Already back then, around 1970, it was pretty clear this guy could really riff off his own work there. He was interviewed by these Tel Kellers, and that was a very important publication because we didn't really have much insight into Derrida before that. He really was sort of explaining himself in those essays, so that was a pretty important source for people trying to catch on to what on earth he was doing in that period. Also, improvisation takes place in terms of a return to something that was left unfinished, an eternal return to something that cannot be exhausted and that requires an infinite going over, and one felt that in his lecturing, that tendency. Then, too, there were improvisations done before the camera, for example, in Derrida, directed by Kirby Dick and Amy Kaufman, and we've all seen that, I take it. 3, performativity of the signature or mark. The performativity of the signature or mark involves an iteration that divides or parcels up the signature as if in order to posit one's identity by means of a mark or representation, that mark or representation has to be multiplied by means of its being divided. So the signature has to do with this iteration and its divisibility. Think about people signing works of art, for example. Of course, the performativity of the signature, which is to say its iterated differentiatedness, has to be gathered together or posited constitutively if the signature is to be the bearer of the signatory's presence, a presence that vouches for or swears to something in lieu of the person's actual being there. That the signature has to supplement a performative speech act as if the signatory's presence were somehow not enough, puts it in the curious logical situation of having both more and less authority than the performative act, if not the actual presence of the person that the signature vouches for. Of course, Derrida's key interest in the signature is its significance in terms of establishing a contractual social relation, something that throughout his work is shown to be aporetic, which leads to my point 4, deontological performativity. This speaks largely to Derrida's concerns in the 90s with the performity of giving, the promise, perjury, forgiveness, pardon, friendship, and hospitality. That seminar on the gift was given much earlier, of course. I believe it's a late 70s seminar. So it was on his mind for a while. But these topics in hospitality, which the social relation is characterized by aporetic ethical relationships that have been developed by Levinas, Blanchot, and Nancy. In much of this work, Derrida made paradoxical formulations that earlier he was less inclined to make. The problem being that paradox could be seen as a reified logical construct. Another way of thinking about this might be to say that as time went on, Derrida arrived at a negative theology of the social relation characterized by paradoxical propositions such as, "Oh friends, there is no friend," or, and here I'm paraphrasing, "I speak only one language and it is not mine." It's that kind of paradoxical formulation I think he was rather loath to make early on. And when we were writing on him back in the 70s, we were trying to avoid those things because we thought, well, wait a minute, that's very reified, that kind of thing. But that seemed to change in the work later on, I think. 5. Performity of power, law, and justice. Pascal's point that one cannot have law without force, but that one can have force without law, speaks to the asymmetry between law and force as performatives that constitute justice as a fundamental social relation that relates to equity, tort, and rights. In a well-known essay on Kafka from the early 80s, Derrida explicated the aporetic contradictions in Kafka's representation of the law as constitutive of law in general, that the execution of a law is always standard and exceptional, usual and unusual, a point also made by Stanley Fish back in the 80s when he looked at how legal decisions are and aren't based on precedent. But whereas Fish saw this solely as an interpretive matter, or as a matter of might makes right, which I think has always been a major theme in Fish's work, Derrida was considering the execution of the law in terms of the impossible performativity of the law as such. 6. Performativity of the destinal. This speaks to the destinal trait of being in Heidegger, it should be big B, in Heidegger. Of course, but also to the avenir in Blanchot, the moment to come that has always already been sent and that is on the way. This speaks to the missive as missile, to the performativity of the messianic and the apocalyptic, but most generally to the temporal horizon of futuricity without which we cannot, or at least do not think, or act. As we know, the destinal has to do with the temporality of both the past and the future, and how they act upon the present as temporal horizons without which the present couldn't be thinkable in terms of a moment whose performativity occurs in relation to other moments of performativity that taken together we might call history, whether secular or religious. Heidegger was actually thinking about much of this stuff around 1930, if you look at some of the work there. Of course, this performativity of the destinal always carries with it the possibility of a destinerance, so that people in Brazil who were cultivating better bees wound up inadvertently releasing that species we call the killer bee into the environment. A bundled action, which is another way of thinking about destinerance, is bundled actions, as it were, that given human fallibility, we know for certain will reoccur sometime in the future when some sort of genetic modification gets away from researchers by accident in, say, the form of a weaponized virus. In a sense, the catastrophic industrial accident that just happened to BP out in the Gulf of Mexico has a sort of destinal quality. All such accidents are destinerances waiting to happen. So those are the 6 performatives. And now I'm going to make a kind of general comment about something else that's more specific. As a brief comment on all of this, let me say that back in the mid-70s, we in America were reading Derrida as a theoretician of textuality. Indeed, Derrida's affiliations with Cornell and the Yale School critics in particular, which was well established by the end of the 70s, reinforced the perception that écriture represented an anti-performative understanding of language and literature, which is to say a conception alien to the kind of literary historicism that was grounded in the life and times of the author. Derrida represented yet another phase in the standoff between textual and historical criticism that had been in place in the United States for a long time. His philological interests, his dedication to meticulous reading, his interest in textual structure as evidenced in Structure, Sign, and Play, and his interest in figuration